It all started with a simple request, one that seemed harmless at first. But looking back, I should have seen the red flags. I should have known that when it came to him, nothing was ever as innocent as it seemed. My ex-boyfriend had a way of making me feel like I owed him something, like I had to prove myself to keep his approval. And this time, it involved our horse, Dusty. Dusty was more than just a horse to me. He had been my best friend since I was a teenager, the one I ran to when things got too overwhelming. The moment I stepped into the barn, his soft eyes and warm breath against my hand could calm me down in ways no person ever could. But my ex, let's call him Jake, didn't see Dusty the way I did. To him, Dusty was just another thing he could use to his advantage. And that's exactly what he did. One evening, Jake showed up at the stable with a camera in hand and that all too familiar smirk on his face. "I have an idea," he said, his tone way too casual for what he was about to suggest. "We should film something with Dusty." I laughed it off at first, thinking he was just being his usual over-the-top self. But then he got serious. He started explaining how this could be a good thing for us, how it would prove something, not just to him, but to everyone else. I remember the way my stomach twisted as he kept talking. Something felt off, but he had a way of making me second-guess myself. "Come on, it's not a big deal," he insisted, brushing a stray piece of hay from my shoulder like we were just having a normal conversation. "You trust me, don't you?" That was his favorite trick, turning everything into a matter of trust. And for so long, I had let him get away with it. Dusty stood quietly between us, completely unaware of the tension building in the air. I ran my fingers through his mane, grounding myself, trying to figure out how to respond. I wanted to say no. Every instinct in my body told me to walk away. But somehow, I found myself nodding. I told myself it was easier that way, that it wasn't worth the fight. But deep down, I knew better. The camera started rolling. Jake's voice was right behind me, telling me what to do, how to stand, how to act. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I held onto Dusty's reins. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching myself from the outside. And then, just when I thought I could go through with it and get it over with, something happened that changed everything. I should have stopped it sooner. I should have walked away. But I didn't. And that one moment set off a chain of events that I never could have predicted. The moment the camera started rolling, I felt trapped. The barn, usually my safe space, suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. Dusty shifted his weight, his ears twitching as if he could sense my unease. I tightened my grip on his reins, trying to steady myself. Jake was behind the camera, watching me with that sharp, expectant look, the one that told me he was in control. "You're overthinking it," he said, his voice light but laced with impatience. "Just do what I told you." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The problem was, I didn't want to do what he told me. But that never seemed to matter. Jake had this way of making me feel like my choices weren't really my own. Every time I hesitated, he'd push just enough to make me feel guilty, to make me question whether I was being too dramatic. I looked at Dusty, his soft brown eyes meeting mine, and for a second, I felt a flicker of strength. Maybe I could put my foot down this time. Maybe I could say no. But before I could speak, Jake sighed loudly, shaking his head. "Come on, don't make this difficult," he muttered. "We don't have all night." That was the moment I knew, I wasn't just doing this for him. I was doing it to avoid the fight. I was doing it because arguing with Jake always ended the same way, with me feeling like I was the problem. And so, I did what I always did. I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. That it was easier to just go along with it. I took a deep breath and followed his instructions, but something in me felt different this time. As I moved, I could feel the weight of the camera on me, capturing everything, turning a private moment into something controlled by Jake. And then, right when I thought I could just push through, it happened. A sudden noise from outside made Dusty jolt, his muscles tensing beneath my hands. My heart lurched as he threw his head up, spooked by something I couldn't see. I turned instinctively, my body shifting, but Jake barely reacted. Instead, he let out an annoyed huff, lowering the camera. "Great," he muttered. "Now we have to start over." I barely heard him. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling. Because for the first time, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about the video anymore. Something else was happening, something I hadn't seen coming. And whatever it was, I knew in my gut that it was only the beginning. Dusty's sudden movement sent my heart into overdrive. I turned toward the barn doors, trying to figure out what had spooked him. The night outside was quiet, but something didn't feel right. My skin prickled, that deep, instinctual feeling that something was off. I glanced at Jake, expecting him to at least acknowledge it, but he was too busy messing with the camera, muttering under his breath. "Relax," he said without even looking at me. "It's probably just the wind." But I wasn't so sure. Dusty wasn't the kind of horse to react like that unless something really unsettled him. I ran a calming hand down his neck, whispering softly to him, but his ears were still flicking back and forth, his muscles tight with tension. I could feel it, that quiet warning that animals always seem to sense before humans do. And yet, Jake just didn't care. That was the thing about him, he never cared about anything that wasn't him. The way he dismissed everything, from my concerns to Dusty's reaction, only made me more uneasy. "We'll have to do this again," he said, more annoyed than anything. "You ruined the shot." I stared at him, my patience wearing thin. "Jake, something's wrong," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I think we should stop." He laughed, actually laughed, like I had just told him the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. "Are you serious? You're really gonna get all dramatic over this?" That was all it took. That one sentence, dripping with condescension, something I had put up with for way too long. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure I could keep pretending that this was okay. I clenched my jaw, my hands tightening around Dusty's reins. The way Jake looked at me, like I was being ridiculous, like my gut feeling didn't matter, made something snap inside me. For so long, I had let him talk me into things, make me doubt myself. But this time felt different. This time, the unease wasn't just in my head. It was in the air, in Dusty's restless movements, in the way my pulse hammered in my ears. Then, it happened. A sharp sound, something metallic clattering just outside the barn. Dusty reared slightly, his nostrils flaring. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the doors, my heart slamming against my ribs. Someone, or something, was out there. Jake let out an irritated groan. "Oh my God, can you just stop? You're making this a bigger deal than it is." I ignored him. Every instinct in my body told me I needed to move, to get away, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. The barn light flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick, heavy, like the moment right before a storm. I swallowed hard, straining to hear past the sound of my own breathing. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Right outside. I grabbed Dusty's bridle, stepping back. Jake, but before I could finish, the barn door creaked. My breath hitched. My pulse roared in my ears. And as the door inched open, revealing a dark figure just beyond the threshold, I realized this wasn't just about the video anymore. This was about something else entirely. The barn door creaked open just enough to send a sliver of moonlight spilling inside. My breath caught as I tried to make out the figure standing in the shadows. Dusty let out a sharp snort, stepping back anxiously, and I instinctively moved with him. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Jake, of course, was unfazed. He let out an annoyed sigh, stepping forward like he had everything under control. "Who the hell is that?" he demanded, his voice sharp, irritated. The figure didn't move. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Dusty shifting uneasily and the distant rustling of the trees outside. Then, a voice, low, unfamiliar. "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran through me. The way he said it, it wasn't a warning. It was a statement, like we had already made a mistake just by being there. I glanced at Jake, waiting for him to react, but he just scoffed. "Oh, give me a break," he muttered, taking another step forward. "If you're trying to scare us, it's not gonna work." I wanted to stop him. Every part of me screamed that we needed to leave, that this wasn't something we should be messing with. But before I could say a word, the figure stepped into the light. My stomach dropped. I knew him. I didn't know his name, but I had seen him before. He was always around the property, watching from a distance. I had always assumed he worked nearby, but something about him had always seemed off. And now, standing in front of us, his face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, I realized something else. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting. Jake, oblivious as ever, rolled his eyes. "Dude, unless you have a real reason to be here, you can get lost." He lifted his camera, muttering, "This is actually great footage, though." The man didn't move. Instead, his eyes flicked to me. "You need to leave. Now." The way he said it, cold, certain, sent a shiver down my spine. Then, Dusty let out a loud, distressed whinny and pulled back, almost yanking me off my feet. I barely managed to hold on, my fingers digging into his reins. Something had really spooked him now, more than before. And that's when I saw it. Just beyond the barn doors, in the darkness, there was something else. Something moving. And whatever it wasn't alone. Dusty yanked harder, nearly knocking me off balance. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I struggled to keep hold of him. But my eyes weren't on him anymore. They were locked on the shadows shifting just beyond the barn doors. At first, it was just a shape, barely visible in the dim light. Then, another. And another. Something, or someone, was out there. Jake, still oblivious, groaned. "Oh my God, this is ridiculous." He turned his camera toward the open doorway. "If you're gonna try and creep us out, at least do a better job." The man in the hood didn't flinch. His gaze was still on me, sharp, expectant. "Get out." His voice was low but urgent, and this time, something in his tone finally got to Jake. "What's your deal, man?" Jake asked, but there was an edge to his voice now, the first hint of doubt creeping in. Then, the sound came. A deep, guttural growl, low and menacing, cutting through the silence like a knife. I froze. It wasn't human. Dusty reared again, panic taking over, and I barely managed to keep hold of him. The shadows outside moved faster now, shifting unnaturally, like whatever was out there wasn't just walking, it was circling. The hooded man took a step toward me, his voice urgent. "If you don't leave now, you won't get another chance." I didn't need to be told again. I turned toward Dusty, preparing to pull him away, when suddenly, Jake screamed. I whipped around just in time to see him stumble back, his camera slipping from his hands and hitting the ground with a sickening crack. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with terror as he pointed toward the doorway. Then, I saw it. A hand, long, clawed fingers curling around the barn door. But it wasn't just the hand. The thing attached to it wasn't right. My stomach twisted. My mind screamed at me to move, but my legs wouldn't work. The hooded man didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing Jake by the arm and shoving him toward me. "Go," he barked. Jake, for once, didn't argue. He turned and bolted, his breath ragged as he ran past me. I barely had time to react before the man yanked Dusty's reins from my hands and pushed me toward the barn doors. "Take the horse and don't stop running." I hesitated for just a second, but then, the growl came again, louder, closer. And this time, it was right behind me. I didn't think. I just ran. Dusty's hooves pounded against the dirt as I swung myself onto his back, my hands shaking as I gripped the reins. Jake was already ahead, sprinting blindly into the night, his breath ragged and uneven. Behind us, the barn filled with an eerie silence, the kind that made my skin crawl. Whatever was in there, it was waiting. Watching. The hooded man stayed behind, standing between us and whatever lurked in the shadows. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He just turned his head slightly, looking at me one last time before the barn doors slammed shut behind him. Dusty bolted forward, sensing the urgency, and I didn't stop him. I didn't look back. I just held on and let him take me away from whatever nightmare we'd stumbled into. The cold air burned my lungs, the wind whipping past my face as we tore through the field, away from the barn, away from the thing I couldn't even begin to understand. It wasn't until we reached the far edge of the property that I finally pulled Dusty to a stop. My hands were still trembling, my heart still pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Jake stood a few feet away, doubled over, gasping for air. He looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with something I had never seen in him before. Fear. "What the hell was that?" he finally managed to say. I shook my head, unable to answer. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything, the hooded man, the thing in the barn, the way Dusty had known before any of us did. None of it made sense, and yet, deep down, I knew we had come way too close to something we were never supposed to see. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his fingers still shaking. We have to tell someone," he stammered. "But tell them what? That we had ignored every warning sign? That we had almost been caught by something we couldn't even explain? Who would believe us?" I looked back toward the barn, now just a dark shape in the distance. The silence that stretched over the land felt heavy, like something had shifted, like we had disturbed something that had been waiting there long before we arrived. I turned back to Jake, my voice quiet but firm. "We're never coming back here." He didn't argue. He just nodded. And without another word, we left.